Most learning video is subject to Ebbinghouse's famous forgetting curve. We forget 50% of anything we learn within an hour, and it keeps fading away. But drama, of course, has the potential to confound this because of its ability to engage emotion. So in this talk, I'll be sharing some tips and ideas to help you create unforgettable drama. Before I start properly, I thought I'd just tell you a little bit about me, what's prompted me to write this book. So it was way back in the 1980s when I started out in corporate video. And it wasn't long before I realized that for me, drama was the most interesting part of it, which is one of the main reasons I began to specialize in video for learning, where I found opportunities to make drama. The other thing I liked about L&D is that you're not selling something on, you're mostly you're just helping people. I've worked in pretty much all the production roles, including camera, editing and writing, but I regard myself as a director. And I must have directed scores, if not hundreds, of learning dramas. That experience, of course, has allowed me to work with many learning designers from all over the UK and beyond, and from many different sectors. So I can say with confidence that there's a lot of learning drama produced. And I can also say that with notable exceptions, most learning designers don't have that much knowledge about how drama works, which means that I'm often asked to sort out problems in a drama project at too late a stage because the basics of the design have already been agreed and signed off. So I thought a good way to intervene in this would be to write a book, a simple book that explains the fundamental techniques and core principles of drama and how they can be applied in L&D. So I wrote one. It's just 18,000 words long, and it's got summary learning points at the end of each chapter. And my aspiration is for it to become a kind of go-to handbook for anyone in L&D working on the drama project. If we can make this kind of knowledge a commonplace, there's no doubt that the quality of learning drama will improve. So let's have a little look at some of the common mistakes and misconceptions about drama in L&D, and then I'll come to the core principles and how to apply them. So film and TV is a seductive medium. So a lot of people, even seasoned pros, get carried away with the superficial aspects of video and go awry. A good example is that first version of the Suicide Squad movie. It looked really cool, had a load of money spent on production design and costume and special effects and cast and heaven knows what, but the script was weak. And even though they re-edited the film twice, the movie was still a mess and a commercial failure. And this allure of the superficial affects video in L&D. There's nothing wrong with wanting to play with the toys of video, but there's a lot of initial pitching L&D video that relies heavily on gimmicks. And these are often techniques that the designer's seen on TV that can be a sexy selling tool, but when they're reappropriated into this new L&D context, they're not always appropriate. One trend that began like this and has now become, I think, somewhat of a dysfunctional staple of L&D is the use of literal point of view. There seems to be a widespread belief that only seems to exist and proliferate in L&D, that if we put the camera in the literal point of view of the protagonist, you will obviously create strong empathy for the main character. And while you're at it, dodge some tricky problems about the representation of diversity. In fact, literal point of view is a device that draws attention to itself, and so it kind of pushes you back from a position of potential empathy with the characters and into a critical position. It's a foregrounding technique. As such, it can be useful, but few in L&D understand how that works, I think. If literal point of view did create greater empathy, it would be a staple of Hollywood, but it doesn't, and it isn't. Another thing that often goes wrong with when designers sit down to write dramatic content is that their stories are written out as an explanation of what happened, which is not surprising, as the more common modes used in learning content are instruction and exposition. Of course, you do need exposition in drama, but it's a necessary evil, and we try to lessen or disguise it. Exposition in drama is tell, don't show. The most powerful dramatic techniques are those that don't draw attention to themselves. Therefore, it's not obvious what they are or how to deploy them. The good news is that dramatic theory is not so hard to grasp. It's a bit like chess with simple rules from which you can generate great complexity. So what is dramatic? What is drama? Drama models characters, and these characters are kind of algorithms that represent worldviews. And when these worldviews come into conflict, the characters are forced to make moral choices, and it's these moral choices which are the core of what drama is about. At home we watch TV drama for relaxation, so you might imagine it as a passive activity, but drama is only successful when it makes your viewers active. And the principal way it does this is by enabling people to imagine themselves in difficult situations and ask themselves, what would I do in that situation? An example I use as a thread in the book is an inexperienced young member of a sales team, Audrey, who works with an older and far more experienced colleague, Danny. Danny's been at it so long that he knows which rules are important and which he can bend. And because she's green, Audrey goes along with him in his rule bending until she becomes complicit. Now what can she do? She wants to get out of this compromised position, but to do so, she either has to give up her colleague or get a transfer. What will she do? You don't necessarily have to answer the question in the drama, you just have to pose it and ask your audience to reflect on the rights and wrongs of that situation. So drama is all about decision making. It's about moral choices, right and wrong. To make a drama engaging and effective, you don't need special effects or drone shots or even Robert De Niro, although that would help. What you need is a script that spends the least time explaining and setting up a situation and the most time with the characters in challenging situations in which they have to make difficult choices. And if your script doesn't fulfill these criteria, your audience won't be fooled. As an audience member, every one of us is very sophisticated. We know the moment we're watching a weak drama, and it soon becomes irritating and fails to engage. So this doesn't mean that our drama has to be deadly serious. Comedy is still all about difficult situations and decisions. Here's a Venn diagram, and this grey area in the middle, the overlap of public and private, that's where workplace drama works best. Drama is not for explaining things. It's no good at teaching processes, for example, even if that process is something that involves people talking to each other. Drama's strength is learning is to stimulate reflection and ideally discussion about the conflicts between duty and emotion. We are emotional, irrational beings working in cultures that impose rational expectations on us to control our emotions and behavior. This needs to be managed, and drama, because it allows you to talk to people's emotional selves, is a very powerful tool in this respect. So what subject areas are we talking about? Well, obviously anything behavioral, such as diversion and inclusion, jobs that involve challenging emotional situations such as safeguarding and healthcare, and personnel management. And we can extend it to compliance because, as in the example I gave earlier with Audrey and Danny, compliance training is literal box ticking unless you can change the culture that enables people to bend the rules. So in each of these subject areas, we model situations in which characters face difficult choices, and this stimulates their learner to ask themselves what they would do in that situation. Yes, the events we show might involve processes or structured meetings and follow procedures, but the drama isn't there to teach these things. It can teach us about their application, and it can help us reflect on the challenges that that presents. So let's have a little look at story structure. Stories are about growth through conflict. Stories are about learning through struggle. A protagonist seeks something, but someone or something is stopping her from getting it. One technical element that's important to understand when we're developing dramatic content is the story structure, beginning, middle, and end. This is the simplest paradigm of a story. 3 acts: setup, confrontation, and resolution. Within this structure lay the events: inciting incident, progressive complications, crisis, climax, and resolution. Now you might be thinking, we can't possibly create a complete story that covers all these elements within an e-learn because we only ever get to make short clips. That is indeed usually the case, but understanding the structure nevertheless is very useful, as I hope will become clear. So let's have a brief look at this classic story structure, beginning with Act 1, the setup. In the setup, we reveal who the characters are, what's important to them. We introduce the protagonist, state the dramatic premise, what the story is about, and reveal the dramatic situation. This contextual exposition is an essential component of a story, but explaining the context of a story is not dramatic. So we therefore seek to dramatize as much exposition as we can and to minimize what remains. In learning, we can often explain the content of the story outside of the video in some text in a course, perhaps. We can also make shortcuts like giving our character a job role that will immediately give her a known relationship to the subject of the story and to the other characters. Now we've established the normality of our imagined world, along comes a disturbance. This is the inciting incident that kicks off the story. In Toy Story, the inciting incident is the arrival of Buzz Lightyear, threatening to displace Woody as Andy's favourite. In Jaws, the inciting incident is shark eats girl, woman as a sheriff has a problem. Corporate drama inciting incidents might be an employee calling in sick again, forcing HR to investigate, or a protagonist notices a colleague bending the rules, causing a threat to the team. In the second act, the protagonist sets out to rectify what's gone wrong in their world. But every time they take an action, the world doesn't respond as they expected. Instead, the problem worsens, stakes get higher, and these are known as progressive complications. In the compliance story I mentioned earlier, Audrey, the protagonist, noticed her colleague Danny bending the rules, endangering himself, the team, and the organization. Now she has a word with him. Nevertheless, his behavior worsens. Maybe he's got an addiction. Every time she tries to help him, he lets her down, and gradually she becomes more and more complicit. The stakes are raised as the risk of blowback becomes unbearable. At each step, the protagonist faces a choice, a moral choice. And all these progressive complications inevitably lead to a crisis. And the crisis is the point when the protagonist must make a choice under pressure. Ideally, the crisis decision should be a dilemma, a choice between two evils, an impossible choice. The harder the choice, the more engaging it is for the viewer and the more it will shed light on your moral message. Should she report her colleague with the inevitable repercussions on him and the guilt she'll feel, or should she just cut herself off from him, transferring to another team and giving up everything she's invested here? This is a kind of heart-stopping crisis moment in which we get a peek into the protagonist's soul while we contemplate her deepest dilemma. Now she makes her choice, and the events tumble out from that decision. And as she makes that decision, we're tipped into Act 3, the resolution. In our little story, the protagonist shows character by choosing a third way. Audrey persuades Danny to seek help because he's got problems. The climax is where we see the consequences of the decision played out, principally Danny's reaction. Witnessing a moral action into which we have a human insight gives us a meaningful experience. This is the peak moment for the creation of meaning in the minds of the audience. The story is now told, but we still have our audience's attention and they want to know what happens next. The audience enjoys seeing the consequences of the moral choice played out in a resolution. How has the resonating force of the climax changed the world for others? Danny approaches management and is given help, a satisfying result, but it would still be satisfying if the protagonist had reported the colleague and had resigned, and he'd resigned bitter. Our satisfaction is derived from the generation of meaning as we watch what are, without our interpretation, meaningless events. As I mentioned, many learning dramas are fractions of a story. The better you understand which part of the larger story you're offering to your audience, the more resonant you can make it. Of course, in L&D, our budgets are usually quite limited, so it's important to understand the limitations we're working with. These are described quite fully in the book, and today I'll share just 3. In video production, all the technicians and cast and the fees we pay for studios and location hire are all in units of days. So productions are designed around what can be filmed in a day, a filming day. At this level of production, we can usually film between 10 and 20 minutes of drama in a day, but this very much depends on the complicating factors. The first of these is the number of the cast. Of course, if your scenes have more characters, the camera coverage is more complicated, so it takes longer to produce a minute of final footage. The cost of a single actor is also significant. It's not just their fee, but the time to source and book them, their travel, food costs, costume, and so forth. So it's also it's always best to try to design your stories with a limited cast. Setup is another significant cost element that's not well understood. Essentially, every time you move the locus of your filming, moving the lights and the camera from one spot to another, you have downtime. So if your production features just 2 people sitting at the same table talking, you can have very high output. If your story features all sorts of settings and locations, plus traveling shots and so forth, or even just moving around a single space, productivity will be less. Of course, it's far more interesting to have lots of characters and settings, so we seek a cost-effective balance to fit the budget. And I'll sum all this up with a real-life case study that demonstrates how the principles can come together. We were working with Health Education England to make some drama about adult safeguarding for a MOOC, which is an ideal place for a drama, I think, because it can get people talking. They had a fixed budget, which looked like it could cover a day's filming with a cast of 6 in a single location, although that was just a working model until we developed the content. Several of the SMEs were keen to depict some kind of the more visceral elements of the work, namely violence and abuse. It's a serious subject and they wanted that to be heard, but I pushed back because to show such scenes, although that might be impactful, isn't likely to advance understanding. Also, violence is quite costly to film effectively, and what they were suggesting would mean filming in several locations with a different cast for each story thread. The course had a focus on multidisciplinary cooperation. So I asked what would happen if someone who was the subject of adult safeguarding had died. Was there any kind of inquiry? It turned out that there was such a thing, so we chose to depict a multidisciplinary meeting which set out to establish a narrative for what had happened to an individual under their care who had died. Showing a meeting allowed the various professionals to question what they would have done in that circumstance, to put themselves into that meeting and into the shoes of one of those characters. In such cases, there are a lot of grey areas, which makes decision-making very tough. And this is a great focus for drama because it raises so many active thoughts in the viewers. In a way, it was like a courtroom drama with record taking, cross-examination, and so forth. And this allowed for plenty of exposition as facts needed to be established. This is handy in a learning context, but it wasn't boring or gratuitous exposition. Every element was laden with meaning, and the different agencies, although they're all working towards the same goal, came into conflict. Were any of them to blame for this, or was it just unfortunate? So here's a little clip from what ended up as about a 20-minute drama. And just before we play it, I just want to say it was written, scripted by Crispin Gare, who's on this call today. So let's have a look.
Okay, so can I just begin by reminding us why we're all here? So on the 19th, we'll all be taking part in a Safeguarding Adults review into the circumstances of Sophia Gillespie's death. So the aim here today is to collate information and to discuss what will contribute to the health element of the SAR on behalf of each of our services.
In my experience, it's all about collective learning. Coming up with recommendations is nothing to worry about.
Thank you, Patrick. So Natalie, can we start with you? As Sophia's GP, you'll have been her first point of contact, of course.
Actually, I wasn't her first point of contact, I mean.
Okay. Well, is there any information you can share with us about her diagnosis or her medical history?
Of course. Sophia was referred to my practice by the mental health team about 4 years ago. I understand that initially she presented to you with concerns about low mood and substance abuse. Apparently she was treated for drug dependency several years previously, but couldn't recall who by or where. She has a 6-year-old daughter who lives in the same town, but with her paternal grandparents. No mention of a father, no ongoing relationships.
Right, so could we have explored her domestic situation in more detail, do you think?
It would have helped us understand her risk factors a bit better.
The record contains one mention of rough sex with a boyfriend, and there's a reference to strangulation. But apparently, Sophia understood the meaning of consent and agreed that this was a consensual sexual activity.
Did she have the mental capacity to agree to that? I thought she had a learning disability.
Well, there's no record of any formal mental capacity assessment. These are locum's notes, but he's...
I don't think Sophia did have a learning disability. That wasn't my experience of her.
Was there a formal diagnosis?
There was a query about a mild learning disability when she first registered, but no confirmation, no.
Was there a reason you didn't look into that? I would have thought professional curiosity would have made...
As I was about to say, the locum who registered Sophia left the practice a while ago. I don't know his rationale.
But it does look like we could have investigated a potential risk factor there.
I'm wondering whether Sophia understood any of the advice our ambulance crews gave her.
Where did this learning disability diagnosis come from again?
I never saw anything.
Does it matter? I mean, Sophia couldn't always communicate clearly. She didn't often understand what was being asked or what she was being told.
But English wasn't her first language, and drug use can cause speech difficulties.
I think we're going down a rabbit hole here. I mean, the point is that there's some gaps in the narrative. Now, who was Sophia's first point of call after she entered the UK?
That would have been my service.
So can you tell us how Sophia came to your attention in the first place, Peter? That might help us to fill in the missing parts of Sophia's story.
Can we just take a break first, because I need to check with my boss about some confidentiality issues?
So, yeah, we did indeed end up with a cast of 6 in a single setting for one filming day. So I hope you can see that this design was productive, cost-effective and stimulating to the learners. And in fact, the story of the young woman whose death the characters were discussing became a thread that was developed throughout the rest of the MOOC.